Hello there, I'm Crime Whispers. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you drift off to sleep, so before you close your eyes tonight, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case story. 1N, the 8th of January, 2002. A security guard named Muhammad Yaqub was carrying out his routine patrols inside the Orchard Towers complex in Singapore. His main duty was straightforward, checking that vehicles parked inside the car park had followed regulations and paid their fees that morning. As he made his way up to the 7th floor, something caught his eye. Parked in the distance was a silver car. Muhammad paused, an uneasy feeling rising in his chest as he walked toward it. A peculiar smell struck him. For anyone who hasn't experienced it, the smell of death is nearly impossible to describe. Many liken it to rotting meat, mixed with the sour temps of spoiled fruit. It's caused by the release of gases such as ammonia and sulfur compounds during decomposition. A smell that once encountered is never forgotten. The closer Muhammad moved to the car, the stronger the odor became. His instincts told him the source of the stench was coming from that very vehicle. Alarmed, he called the police, not realizing that his discovery was about to unravel one of Singapore's most notorious murder cases. When officers arrived at the scene, they too were overwhelmed by the unmistakable odor of decay. Without hesitation, they forced the car open. What they found inside would shock even the most seasoned investigators. Two bodies, both in advanced stages of decomposition. The back seat lay a wooden picnic basket inside. It was the body of a 46-year-old Singaporean man named Kunan. His remains suggested he had met a violent end in the trunk. Police uncovered the second victim, a woman's body wrapped tightly in blankets, her head enclosed in layers of plastic bags bound with neckties. Blood stains seeping through the plastic left no doubt about the brutal nature of her death. She was identified as 29-year-old Suzio Lan Yaming, better known as Suzy Lan. Originally from China, she had arrived in Singapore just months earlier, in October 2001, hoping to build a career as a teacher. The investigation revealed that Suzy was in a romantic relationship with Kunan at the time of her death. Though she was still married in China and had two 8-year-old twin sons waiting for her back home, Kunan, on the other hand, was a father of 3, estranged from his wife. What investigators quickly realized was that this was no suicide pact. Both victims had died violently. Forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Sutchu determined that Kunan had been strangled, while Suzy had died of suffocation. Kunan was eventually identified by his distinctive tattoos. As for Suzy, her remains were later claimed by her 32-year-old husband, who had to travel from China to bring her homeland's husband. Lin worked for a telecommunications firm, but his somber reunion with her remains came only 10 months after her death. When asked about it, Lin admitted he was stunned to learn that his wife had even been in Singapore at all, hinting that the couple may have been living apart for some time. According to Lin, during her stay abroad, Lan had called him weekly without fail. Their last conversation was on December 29, 2001, just days before her body was discovered. She had promised him that she would return home to Fujian, China, to celebrate the Lunar New Year together, but that promise was never kept. For months, the identity of the Orchard Towers female victim remained a mystery. It was only through the careful examination of her personal belongings and DNA samples provided by Lin that investigators were finally able to confirm her as Suzy Lan. That revelation left Lin devastated. He had spent 3 months desperately trying to re-establish contact with his wife, only to discover the truth in the most tragic way imaginable. As police pieced together the last days of both Lan and Kunan, their search led them to an apartment in Balmoral Park. The property was owned by a 64-year-old British expatriate named Michael McCrae, born in 1958 in the UK. McCrae had never been considered academically gifted. He left school before completing his O-levels, but what he lacked in education, he more than made up for in business acumen. In 1980, He achieved national recognition when he earned the title of Nottingham's £1 million man, after generating profits of £12 million in less than 9 months while working at a financial services firm by the 1990s. McRae had moved to Southeast Asia, where he built a career as a financial advisor in Singapore. It was there that he met his future Australian wife, Brunetta Staco, with whom he had 4 children, including a son named Callum, who was just 2 years old in 2003, at the height of his career. McRae even published a book titled Expat Survival Kit, aimed at guiding expatriates in managing their finances in Singapore, but McRae's professional success did not last. Accusations of financial misconduct and violations of financial regulations followed, resulting in heavy fines and tarnishing his once respected name. Around this same time, McRae was living at the Pinewood Gardens condominium in Balmoral Park, where he gained a reputation for throwing loud, extravagant parties that irritated his neighbors. His personal life soon unraveled as well, disapproving of his reckless lifestyle. His wife eventually left him and returned to Australia with their children, rather than attempting reconciliation. McRae instead threw himself into amateur boxing, perhaps as a way to cope, or perhaps a reflection of his increasingly self-absorbed attitude. In June 2001, McRae met Audrey Ang, a waitress he encountered at a local pub there. Romance quickly escalated, and before long, she had moved into his Balmoral Park apartment. But McRae's household was far from simple. Audrey found herself sharing the residence with not just McRae, but also 41-year-old Koonin Kwan and his girlfriend. Susie Lan. McRae had first met Koonin in 1998. When Koonin was working as a taxi driver, the two quickly bonded, and McRae later hired him as his personal driver. McRae often spoke of Koonin's friendly and charismatic personality, which left a strong impression on nearly everyone. McKoonin himself, had not planned on being a taxi driver forever. He once ran his own electronics business, but it went bankrupt in 1989. He later helped in his brother's pet food venture, and even attempted to start another business of his own in 1992, but success eluded him still. By 1997, his work ethic was recognized, when he earned awards for outstanding service as a driver. Despite his outward charm, Koonin was also known for his reckless personal life, particularly his extramarital affairs. He frequently spent nights with foreign women and sex workers, developing a reputation that followed him even into his professional life. But none of these flaws seemed to matter much to McRae, who kept him close as both a friend and employer. Koonin and McRae had developed a close bond over the years. McRae often called him on and rewarded him generously for his loyalty and services there. Friendship, if anything, only seemed to grow stronger with time, but in the early hours of January 2, 2002, that bond would come to a chilling end. McRae, his girlfriend Audrey Nan, and Susie Lan had gathered in the Balmoral Park apartment to toast the new year. The mood was festive. The drinks flowed freely, and for a while it was just another late night at McRae's party-filled residence. But as the hours wore on, tensions shifted. A heavily intoxicated Koonin rose from his seat, seemingly intent on confronting Audrey, who was sitting quietly on the sofa. McRae's eyes followed his every move. What happened next remains uncertain, but within just a few days, both Koonin and Susie would be found dead on January 8, 2002. Their decomposing bodies were discovered inside a silver Daewoo parked at Orchard Towers. By then, McRae and Audrey were already gone. Police quickly named them prime suspects. Michael McRae was identified as the main perpetrator, while Audrey Ang, his girlfriend, was suspected of playing a key role as his accomplice. Their names were placed on Singapore's most wanted list, and Interpol was alerted almost immediately. The pair were classified as international fugitives. Investigators from Singapore Immigration and Checkpoints authorities soon discovered that McRae and Audrey had left Singapore on January 5. Just 3 days before the grim discovery, they had boarded a flight to London. A revelation that shifted the search across continents. Cooperation between Singaporean and British authorities intensified. But Britain's sheer size and population of nearly 60 million people made the manhunt incredibly challenging still. Clues began to emerge. It's believed the couple stayed in London for some time before boarding a flight to Australia. That trip may have tipped off investigators, leading to the long-awaited breakthrough. It would take 5 months before the fugitives were finally cornered in mid-2002. Australian police arrested Michael McRae and Audrey Ang in Melbourne, hiding in the home of McRae's estranged pregnant wife. Their arrest marked a turning point in the case, but the fight for justice was far from over. Audrey Ang was the first to be extradited. On November 10, 2002, she was sent back to Singapore, where she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of tampering with evidence. On February 8, 2003, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison because she was a Singaporean citizen. Her extradition process was swift and straightforward, but McRae's situation was far more complicated. Though arrested at the same time as Audrey, he remained in a high-security Australian prison. The obstacle was simple, but insurmountable. Singapore had the death penalty for murder. Australia, having abolished capital punishment in 1985, could not legally extradite someone to face possible execution. This created a legal and diplomatic deadlock. Determined to bring McRae back to stand trial, Singapore entered into negotiations with Australian authorities. The key sticking point was the punishment. After months of discussion, Singapore made a rare and strategic concession. Assurances were given that McRae would not face the death penalty, even if convicted. Legal experts noted that, under Singaporean law, even if McRae had been sentenced to death, he would have retained multiple avenues of appeal, including the right to petition the President of Singapore for clemency in practice. This meant his sentence could be commuted to life imprisonment. This unprecedented assurance eased Australia's concerns and paved the way forward in one of Singapore's most complex extradition battles. It was Singapore's concession, the guarantee that Michael McRae would not face execution, that finally convinced Australia to approve his extradition. On November 16, 2002, the order was granted, but if anyone thought this marked the end of the saga, they were mistaken. McRae immediately launched a series of legal maneuvers to block the extradition. What followed was a drawn-out battle in the courts of Australia that dragged on for more than 3 years. One by one, his appeals failed. By his 4th and final attempt, the High Court of Australia rejected his plea, leaving him with no further recourse. During this period, authorities placed him under intense security at one point, restraining him in a straitjacket to prevent self-harm. Finally, on September 27, 2005, Michael McRae was extradited back to Singapore. He was immediately charged with 2 counts of murder. 9 months later, on June 25, 2006, his trial began in the High Court. He was 48 years old, according to the prosecution. The chain of events began after McRae hosted a New Year's Eve party on January 1, 2002, at his Balmoral Park apartment. As the night wound down and guests departed, Coonan and Susie helped tidy up, while McRae and Audrey enjoyed drinks. But something was off with Coonan when asked. He admitted he had taken drugs later. In a sudden outburst, he hurled a crude remark at Audrey in Mandarin she related to McRae, who confronted Coonan. Tensions flared. McRae pushed him against the wall, telling him to sleep it off. But Coonan, intoxicated and volatile, didn't back down. Instead, he lashed out. He threw a chair, then struck McRae with a vase, breaking it and wielding the shards as weapons. McRae claimed he pleaded with him to stop, but Coonan threatened to kill him in a violent struggle. McRae fought back, raining punches on him before ultimately strangling him. Coonan collapsed, barely breathing. McRae and Audrey tried in vain to revive him, but he died shortly afterward. Panic set in. They placed his body in a wicker basket and turned their attention to Susie as she tried to leave the flat. They intercepted her and locked her in Coonan's room for the next 2 days. She was kept alive on chocolate, juice, and water, while McRae interrogated her about Coonan's hidden money, including a $20,000 bonus he had recently received. Meanwhile, McCrae enlisted outside help. He contacted Gemma Ramsbottom, a former secretary of his, while Audrey reached out to Augustine Co. Audrey told him bluntly that Michael had gotten into a fight and needed help to dissolve a dead rat. On the evening of January 3, 2002, Susie's ordeal ended. Gemma entered the flat as McCrae brought Susie to the living room. There, he wrapped layers of plastic bags around her head and neck, knowing full well it would suffocate her with both victims dead. The group turned to covering their tracks. They scrubbed the apartment, gathered Coonan's belongings, and loaded them into the car. The wicker basket containing Coonan's body was placed in the back seat. Weighed down with clothes and dumbbells, Susie's body, wrapped and bound, was put in the trunk along with her personal items to mask the odor. McCrae sprayed air fresheners throughout the vehicle that night. Michael drove across Singapore with Gemma in the passenger seat and Audrey in the back, scouting for a place to abandon the car. Their grim journey ended at the car park of Orchard Towers, where the Daewoo was left behind in court. McCrae admitted to killing both Coonan and Susie, but pleaded for leniency. He told the court he had been haunted by guilt, tormented by the fact that he had killed a man he once considered a brother since meeting Coonan in 1998. McCrae insisted he had only ever wanted the best for him, despite his pleas. The court was unmoved. The evidence laid out by the prosecution painted a chilling picture. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated effort to silence witnesses and cover tracks. The trial revealed that McCrae had not acted alone. Gemma Ramsbottom, his former secretary, and Augustine Co., a man pulled into the scheme by Audrey, both assisted in the aftermath. Gemma had helped clean the flat and stood by while Susie was suffocated. Augustine had aided in attempts to dispose of evidence for their roles. The court dealt separate sentences. Gemma, who cooperated with investigators and testified against McCrae, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for helping conceal the crime. Augustine received 5 years for his involvement in attempting to dispose of evidence, but McCrae's fate was far graver. August 29, 2006. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the High Court of Singapore found Michael McCrae guilty on 2 counts of culpable homicide not amounting to murder. A verdict that spared him the death penalty, but still carried a heavy weight. The court concluded that while Coonan's death occurred in a violent struggle, Susie's killing was deliberate, designed to eliminate her as a witness. Justice V.K. Raja sentenced McCrae to 24 years in prison, the maximum possible sentence under the reduced charges. He would be nearly 70 years old before even becoming eligible for releases. For Audrey Ang, who had already been sentenced to 12 years for tampering with evidence, her punishment stood together. Their convictions closed one of Singapore's most shocking and high-profile murder cases of the early 2000s. In the years since, the Orchard Towers murders have remained a dark reminder of how quickly loyalty, greed, and violence can intertwine. What began as a friendship between 2 men, McCrae and Coonan, ended in betrayal, suffocation, and a grisly discovery in a car park that horrified an entire nation. During the trial, Michael McCrae's defense emphasized that the tragic chain of events began on the night of the altercation, when he urged Coonan to rest due to his drug use. His lawyer argued there had been no intent to cause harm, and pointed to Michael's efforts to revive Coonan after realizing he had lost consciousness. The prosecution, however, focused on the aggravating elements. They argued that Michael's response to Coonan's provocation was wildly disproportionate, leading to a brutal assault and ultimately to Coonan's death. More damning still, they underscored Susie's involvement, that she had been an innocent bystander, present at the wrong time, simply because she had witnessed Coonan's death. Michael made the chilling decision that she, too, had to be silenced rather than accepting responsibility and notifying authorities. Prosecutors said Michael's priority was to cover his tracks and recover the bonus money he had previously given Coonan. He then fled Singapore, hoping to escape accountability altogether. On June 29, 2006, the High Court Judge Chu Han-tek handed down the verdict. Michael McCrae was sentenced to 24 years in prison, 10 years for each charge of culpable homicide, and an additional 4 years for tampering with evidence. Under Singapore's remission system, if he demonstrated good behavior while incarcerated, he would be eligible for a 1/3 reduction in his sentence. That meant McCrae could have been released as early as June 29, 2022, after serving a minimum of 16 years. Story to the collapse of Ban Chao Daemon, July 29, 1975. A tropical storm began to form over the Philippine Sea, slowly moving northwest toward Taiwan by August 1st. The system had strengthened into a powerful typhoon as it swept across Taiwan. Typhoon Nina left devastation in its wake, 25 people killed, 68 injured, and widespread structural damage as winds howled at speeds of nearly 250 kilometers per hour. But the storm was far from over. By July 31st, it reached peak strength and was officially named Typhoon Nina. Its destructive force then shifted toward mainland China. On August 3rd, it made landfall, tearing through the countryside before stalling over Hunan province. On August 5th, it was here that the Ban Chao Dam stood. A structure once celebrated as a symbol of modern engineering and China's ambition to tame the might of its rivers, built to withstand extreme conditions. The dam was thought to be unbreakable, but Typhoon Nina's rains pushed nature beyond anything the engineers had anticipated. By August 8, relentless rainfall had swollen the reservoir far past its capacity. Water levels climbed 30 centimeters above the safety limit, and the dam's embankments began to erode. Despite its reinforced design, Ban Chao buckled under the crushing pressure. A catastrophic instant. The dam gave way, a wall of water 10 kilometers wide, 5 meters high, and surging forward at speeds up to 50 kilometers per hour, swept across the plains of Henan province. Everything in its path was destroyed. Homes, roads, and bridges were obliterated. Power and communication lines were torn apart. Entire villages were swallowed whole as the torrent rushed downstream. Its force triggered a chain reaction. Dozens of smaller dams collapsed one after another in a deadly domino effect. The disaster that followed became one of the deadliest floods in recorded history, claiming an estimated 230,000 lives through drowning, disease, and famine. From one-up media, this is mass murders. Nestled within China's central plains, Henan province is defined by its unique geography. The surrounding mountains funnel vast amounts of rainfall into the Huai River Valley, a natural catchment that has long brought both prosperity and destruction in times of abundance. The river nourishes farmland and sustains communities, but in seasons of heavy rain, it swells rapidly, unleashing devastating floods and drought. It shrinks, leaving villages desperate for water. This cycle of extremes spurred the government to launch the Harness the Huai River initiative in the early 1950s. The ambitious project called for the construction of 3 major reservoirs and dams in the region of these. The Ban Chao Dam was the centerpiece. It was designed not only to mitigate recurring floods, but also to provide irrigation for agriculture and generate hydroelectric power. What had begun as a symbol of progress and national pride would, in August 1975, become the epicenter of one of the greatest human-made disasters in modern history. With this ambitious vision, construction of the Ban Chao Dam began in the 1950s under the Harness the Huai River initiative. Engineers and government officials touted it as a marvel of modern design. A dam so strong it was nicknamed the Iron Dam, and believed to withstand anything nature could unleash. But in their optimism, planners overlooked one critical reality. No structure, no matter how strong, is invincible. When Typhoon Nina struck in August 1975, the rain that followed far exceeded all predictions. The dam's reservoir filled at a pace engineers had never prepared for. On August 7th, emergency sluice gates were opened in a desperate attempt to relieve the rising waters, but it was too late. The rainfall overwhelmed the system. By the night of August 8th, Water levels climbed over 30 centimeters beyond the dam's limit. The relentless pressure weakened its foundation. Until finally, at around 1 a.m., on August 9, 1975, the Banqiao Dam failed. What followed was nothing short of apocalyptic. A massive wall of water, to 10 kilometers wide, 5 meters high, and moving at nearly 50 kilometers per hour, exploded across the plains of Henan province. Entire villages vanished in minutes. Roads, bridges, and farmlands were swallowed whole. Power lines and communication towers were ripped apart, plunging the region into silences. The flood surged downstream. It unleashed a domino effect. 62 smaller dams collapsed one after another, amplifying the devastation. Those who weren't swept away immediately were left stranded without food, clean water, or shelter. Disease spread rapidly in the days that followed. In total, over 26,000 people drowned within hours, and another 200,000 perished from famine and disease in the aftermath. By the time the waters receded, the Banqiao Dam failure had claimed an estimated 230,000 lives, making it the deadliest dam disaster in human history. The catastrophe was kept largely hidden from the outside world for decades. The Chinese government, wary of embarrassment and political fallout, downplayed the true scale of the tragedy. Survivors were silenced, reports were censored, and only in the 1990s did the full story begin to emerge. The Banqiao disaster remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of overconfidence in engineering, the unpredictability of nature, and the catastrophic costs when warnings are ignored. In the days following the Banqiao collapse, Henan province was unrecognizable. Survivors described the scene as if the earth itself had cracked open. Entire villages were erased from maps, and the silence after the rushing flood was described as more terrifying than the roar itself. Those who managed to climb to higher ground endured unthinkable suffering for a week. Many were stranded without rescue, surrounded by water and corpses. Food supplies rotted, clean water was scarce, and diseases like dysentery and cholera spread unchecked. Witness accounts tell of children crying for days without comfort, parents digging through mud with bare hands for signs of loved ones, and families forced to drink contaminated floodwaters just to survive. The Chinese government, however, restricted outside help. Aid was slow and insufficient, partly due to damaged infrastructure, but also because officials feared exposing the scale of the tragedy. Survivors later revealed that many were left to fend for themselves for over a week, before meaningful assistance arrived. When the waters finally receded, the numbers were staggering. 26,000 drowned instantly in the initial flood, and additional 200,000 died from starvation, exposure, and disease. In the weeks that followed, more than 11 million people were displaced. Yet, for decades, the disaster remained shrouded in secrecy. International observers had little to no knowledge of the event, and the few reports that leaked were quickly dismissed as rumors. It wasn't until the 1990s, during a period of gradual transparency in China, that the true scale of the catastrophe began to surface. By then, survivors had lived for years with memories they had been forbidden to share. For many, the Banqiao Dam failure was not only a natural disaster, but also man-made tragedy. Engineers had warned of potential flaws in the dam's design. Emergency preparedness was inadequate. Communication failures meant villages downstream weren't properly warned of the impending collapse. Today, the Banqiao disaster is studied worldwide as a lesson in the limits of human engineering against nature's power. Modern dam designs often reference Banqiao as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the strongest walls can crumble if arrogance and politics outweigh caution and preparation. For the survivors of Henan, however, the disaster was far more personal. Families fractured, futures erased, and generations lost in one night of relentless water. Their voices remind us that behind every statistic lies human suffering, and that the true cost of the Banqiao collapse can never fully be measured. Construction of the project began in April 1951. But almost immediately, a host of challenges emerged. The first was the workforce itself. Many of the Chinese laborers recruited had little to no experience with large-scale reservoir construction. Most had only worked on small dam projects in nearby provinces, leaving them unprepared for the technical and logistical demands of a project of this magnitude. As a result, the design, planning, and much of the supervision fell to Soviet experts, who were deeply involved in dam construction across China during this era. After 15 grueling months, the Banqiao Dam was finally completed in 1953, celebrated as a symbol of the nation's progress. But soon, small cracks began to appear in the dam's concrete walls, a troubling sign of structural weakness. Recognizing the risk, a reinforcement effort was launched between 1955 and 1956. Once again under the guidance of Soviet advisors, this drive for dam building was part of a much larger vision. In 1949, following Mao Zedong's rise to power and the establishment of the communist state, China embarked on an ambitious initiative to modernize through massive infrastructure. Dam construction became a cornerstone of Mao's Great Leap Forward, and by the late 1950s, over 100 dams had been built across Henan province alone. Among them, the Banqiao Dam stood as one of the largest and most ambitious yet. While the political momentum behind the project was unstoppable, not everyone shared Mao's enthusiasm. One voice of dissent came from Chen Xing, the chief engineer overseeing the projects. Chen cautioned that the government's obsession with water storage overlooked critical risks first. He warned that overemphasis on reservoirs could cause soil alkalinization, a process where farmland becomes infertile due to mineral buildup, rendering the land barren and food production impossible. Second, and more urgent, Chen argued that the sheer number of dams being constructed would artificially raise water levels throughout Henan, creating a recipe for disaster if extreme flooding occurred. His warnings were ignored instead. Chen was denounced as a rightist and opportunist, stripped of his position, and banished to Xinjiang. History would later prove him right. During the Great Leap Forward, reservoirs were seen not only as infrastructure, but as symbols of revolutionary ideology in Chinese philosophy. Water had long been revered as a source of life, prosperity, and harmony. To retain more water was not just a practical matter, it was framed as an expression of the people's collective will to build a new future under Mao. But Mao's ambitions extended beyond water. Determined to catapult China into industrial supremacy, he launched a campaign to boost steel production, ordering the creation of thousands of small backyard furnaces. Families across China melted down their household pots and pans, believing they were forging the country's industrial future. By 1959, it became clear that the steel produced was of poor quality, unfit for real use. Only large factories with proper fuel sources like coal could produce usable steel. Quietly, the program was abandoned, but not before it caused mass deforestation, as millions of trees were cut to feed the furnaces. With hillsides stripped bare, the soil grew loose and unstable, primed for disaster once heavy rains returned. By late July 1975, the region was parched. After months of drought, crops withered, rivers ran low, and reservoirs held dangerously little water. Determined to capture every drop of the coming rains, dam operators kept the floodgates tightly shut. At first, it seemed their gamble might pay off. When Typhoon Nina struck China's eastern coast, the inland regions experienced only mild effects, raising hopes that the storm had weakened. But as Nina drifted northward, its force began to straight toward Hunan. Weakened and downgraded to a storm, Typhoon Nina might have initially brought relief to many in Hunan province. After all, the destructive winds of a typhoon are often feared most, but storms carry their own brand of rainfall that, under the wrong conditions, can prove just as lethal. For the next 3 days, the remnants of Nina poured relentlessly over Hunan. Some regions reported rainfall rates of nearly 7 inches an hour, while in others, totals climbed to a staggering 16 meters within just 6 hours. One of those locations was the Banqiao Dam. Shortly after 1 a.m. on August 8, the water level at Banqiao rose more than 100 meters above sea level. 30 centimeters higher than the dam's protective wave wall. The structure began to falter under the immense pressure in the stillness of the night. The roar of rushing water echoed across the valley, but most residents nearby remained asleep, blissfully unaware of the catastrophe about to unfold when the dam finally gave way. It unleashed a tidal wave barreling down the valley at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. The collapse triggered a domino effect, toppling 62 other dams in rapid succession. Villages in its path were erased within minutes, flattened by a wall of water that continued surging for 6 relentless hours. That night at Banqiao was one of desperation under the dim glow of fluorescent lamps. Workers frantically piled sandbags against the dam's wall, fighting to hold back the rising floodwaters. They knew all too well the stakes. If the dam failed, thousands would be swept away in their sleep still. The storm was merciless. Just after 1 a.m., the skies cleared and stars appeared above, giving the illusion of safety. A shout rang out. The water level is going down. The flood is retreating. Exhausted workers breathed a sigh of relief, but the calm was a cruel deception. Moments later, water equal to 280,000 Olympic swimming pools tore through the dam, shattering concrete with an explosion like crack. What followed was apocalyptic. A monstrous wave, 10 kilometers wide and up to 7 meters high, thundered down the valley at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. Houses crumpled like cardboard, vehicles tumbled like toys, and trees were ripped from the ground as though they were weeds in souping. Residents were jolted awake by the eerie sound of giant slabs of concrete slamming against the earth like distant artillery fire. Seconds before the wave engulfed them for 6 unbroken hours. The floodwaters raged across an area 55 kilometers long and 15 kilometers wide, swallowing entire communities in some areas near the dam. The sheer volume of water formed vast temporary lakes, some as large as 12,000 square kilometers around, 16 times the size of Singapore in total. 7 counties were submerged, thousands of square kilometers of countryside drowned, and tens of thousands of lives lost in an instant. The tragedy was compounded by the absence of warning. Floodwaters would have taken hours to reach the farthest counties, time that could have saved many lives, but communication systems had been crippled. Days of typhoon winds had already downed telephone lines and telegraph systems, isolating communities. The Chinese military reportedly tried to fire flares to warn nearby counties, but the signals were misunderstood. As a result, most residents remained unaware of the looming catastrophe until it was too late. The Banqiao collapse also triggered a devastating chain reaction as the unleashed torrent surged downstream. It forced other dams to fail one after another, magnifying the destruction. Authorities, desperate to slow the flood's momentum, even ordered the Air Force to bomb certain dams, deliberately hoping to redirect water and disperse the surge. But the strategy barely dented the flow. The floodwaters pressed on, overwhelming the Quan River, the largest tributary of the Ying River and the Huai River basin. The river's dikes began to fail, further widening the scope of disaster. By the evening of August 9th, barriers designed to regulate water levels from the river finally gave way. The collapse sent torrents rushing toward surrounding regions, completely flooding Fuong County in Anhui Province. The distance from the Banqiao Dam to Anhui was nearly 570 kilometers. Yet the floodwaters reached its outskirts in less than 24 hours. The death toll remains one of the most disputed aspects of this disaster. Unofficial estimates place the number of lives lost anywhere between 85,000 and 240,000. In August 1975, the Communist Party Committee in Henan Province reported preliminary figures of 85,681 deaths within the province, with the total likely under 100,000 when including victims from outside the region. These figures were presented to the Central Committee of the Communist Party and considered relatively accurate at the time, but years later, the truth appeared, far grimmer. In the 1980s, representatives of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference revealed that the death toll was, in fact, above 230,000. A 1995 Human Rights Watch report supported this figure, and by 2005, a Discovery Channel program ranked the Banqiao Dam collapse as the greatest technological disaster in human history, deadlier than the Chernobyl nuclear accident. Their reporting cited over 200,000 fatalities, with more than 140,000 deaths caused not by the flood itself, but by famine, infection, and epidemic outbreaks in its aftermath in the weeks following the collapse. The disaster deepened. The Jingguang Railway, a vital transport route linking Beijing and Guangzhou, was cut off for 18 days, along with other critical communication lines for survivors. This isolation was devastating. Aid could not reach them quickly. Despite the government deploying over 40,000 soldiers from the People's Liberation Army for relief efforts, entire cities remained cut off from the outside world. 9 days after the disaster, over 1 million people were still stranded, surrounded by floodwaters, and dependent on food airdrops. They were cold, hungry, and sleeping without shelter, and with stagnant water came disease. Malaria, yellow fever, and other illnesses spread rapidly among survivors, who had little to no access to medicine. Those who weren't killed by infection succumbed to starvation. The damage was staggering, estimated at $513 million at the time, which equals nearly $3 billion today when adjusted for inflation in modern China. Such a loss might not cripple the economy, but it would still place immense strain on government resources. Rebuilding infrastructure, providing aid, and restoring commerce would likely trigger budget deficits, borrowing, and nationwide ripple effects. The collapse of the Jingguang Railway, alone a major transportation artery, would disrupt supply chains, delay trade, and affect millions. And yet, despite its scale, the Banqiao Dam disaster is barely remembered today. Ask people outside Henan province, and many will know little about it. That is because the Chinese government moved swiftly to suppress news of the collapse in the 1970s. Under Chairman Mao Zedong's leadership, political stability and the image of the Communist Party as infallible were paramount to admit that a massive state-backed project had failed so catastrophically would have undermined the party's authorities, so the government enforced silence. No media outlet was permitted to cover the event. Official documents were locked away as state secrets, hidden from public knowledge for decades. It wasn't until 2005 that records of the disaster were declassified. Today, the Banqiao Dam collapse stands as one of history's deadliest structural failures, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. But its memory has faded, overshadowed by later historical events and buried under years of censorship. Though no longer entirely forgotten, it remains a tragedy that the world has only slowly come to understand. Another massive wave of dam construction swept across China in 2015, culminating in the completion of one of the world's largest hydroelectric projects, the Three Gorges Dam in Hubei province. But in 2020, Beijing quietly acknowledged that the 24-kilometer structure had slightly deformed under the pressure of record-breaking floods, though officials were quick to insist that the dam remained perfectly safe. Story 3. It was April 24, 2016, in central Vietnam. At first glance, the waters around the industrial park in Ha Tinh province's Cayenne district looked calm, ordinary, but beneath the surface, danger lurked. A team of 6 professional divers was dispatched on a routine assignment to check the underwater structure of a new breakwater for the deepwater port in Vung Ang. Among them was 46-year-old Le Van N, a seasoned diver who had spent decades exploring and working in these seas. This dive, however, would be his last. Le Van's mission was straightforward: inspect the breakwater, designed to shield the coast from powerful tidal surges. But as he and his team descended into the depths, something felt wrong. The divers began to experience an inexplicable wave of exhaustion, followed by severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. Le Van, who knew these waters better than most, immediately sensed that something was terribly off. The team aborted the dive and made a frantic dash for the surface. By the time they reached land, The damage had been done, toxic exposure had already set in, ambulances rushed them to hospital, sirens echoing through the district. But for Levan, it was too late, despite desperate medical efforts. He died that same day. His sudden death would thrust the Formosa steel plant disaster into the national spotlight. A catastrophe that would later be called Vietnam's worst marine environmental tragedies. Spill would go on to claim more lives, devastate Vietnam's marine ecosystem, and shatter the livelihoods of thousands of fishing families from One Up Media. This is Mass Murders. Ha Tin Province, located along Vietnam's north-central coast, has long been a land of contrast, rich in culture and natural beauty, but economically underdeveloped for decades. The province relied primarily on agriculture, struggling with poverty and limited infrastructure to change that. The Vietnamese government in the early 2000s launched the ambitious Vung Ang Industrial Zone, a sprawling 20,000-hectare project, half the size of Singapore, designed to attract foreign investment and transform the region into an industrial hub. Among the foreign investors was the Taiwanese conglomerate Formosa Plastics Group, which began construction of a massive steel plant for years. The industrial zone grew steadily, roads were built, and factories rose. Environmental concerns, if raised at all, were largely dismissed as the promise of jobs and economic growth overshadowed potential risks. By 2016, Formosa's steel plant, officially known as Hung Gip Formosa Ha Tin Steel Corporation, was nearing completion, but that same year, troubling signs began to emerge. On April 6th, a local diver noticed something unusual while exploring the usually vibrant coral reefs of Cayenne. Visibility was poor that day, but what caught his attention was a strange yellowish tint clouding the water following the trail. He discovered a massive pipe, partially buried beneath the seabed, spewing an unidentified yellow substance directly into the ocean. Alarmed, he documented the finding and reported it to authorities. Investigations revealed the pipeline was connected to the Formosa steel plant. The next morning, April 7th, tragedy struck. Fishermen from the villages of Kai Ha and Kai Loi prepared to collect their daily harvest, only to discover their fish pens filled with lifeless bodies. Groupers, a prized catch in the local markets, floated belly up. More than 4,000 farmed fish were found dead that day alone. Meanwhile, on the other side of Ha Tin, divers leading recreational tours for visitors began noticing the same strange changes. The seawater tasted bitter, metallic, and unnatural. The ocean was definitely weird that day. One diver recalled soon after surfacing, several began to experience nausea, dizziness, and pounding headaches. The sea, once a source of life and livelihood, was turning toxic. Experts in the coastal communes of Cayenne initially believed the mass fish deaths on their farms would remain an isolated incident, but the disaster soon spread outward, sweeping across neighboring provinces and devastating hundreds of fishing communities in central Vietnam. In April 8, 2016, fishermen across Ha Tin and beyond set out to sea with the same hopes they always carried, that the ocean would provide. Yet, as the sun rose higher, something horrifying unfolded. For more than 200 kilometers of coastline, waves of lifeless fish began washing ashore. Carcasses of baitfish, shrimp, and even large deep-sea species littered the sand and the seabed. The scale of destruction was catastrophic. An estimated $50,000 worth of seafood was spoiled almost overnight, rendered unfit for human consumption. Yet, many locals, unaware of the danger, gathered the dead fish, eating them, selling them at discount prices, or feeding them to their families. At first, the scene almost felt like a blessing. Nets came back heavy, markets overflowed, and fish seemed abundant, but it was an illusion, one that quickly turned deadly. By April 19th, tragedy struck in Quang Bien Nguyen Province. An 8-year-old girl was rushed to hospital after dining on seafood with her family. She suffered severe headaches, nausea, and diarrhea. Investigators traced the meal back to markets selling fish collected from the shoreline. Soon, hospitals across central Vietnam were overwhelmed with patients reporting the same symptoms: nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and diarrhea after eating seafood that should have been safe. The Vietnamese government stepped in, warning the public to avoid seafood from the affected areas, but for many, the warnings came too late. Scientists were called in to uncover the cause. Early tests dismissed rumors of a viral outbreak and instead pointed to the sea itself. The waters were contaminated with dangerous chemicals. Laboratory results revealed alarming levels of phosphate, ammonium, chromium, and phenol, the latter a corrosive chemical discovered to be 56 times higher than safe levels, while phosphates are relatively harmless and even essential in small doses. The others were deadly. Cyanide, chromium, and phenol, when ingested, can trigger severe poisoning, internal bleeding, and even death. Attention quickly shifted toward industrial activity along the coast. The mix of chemicals found in the water was consistent with industrial waste discharged. The crisis deepened on April 24, 2016, when a local diver named Levan died after exploring waters near the Vung Ang industrial zone within days. 3 more people lost their lives under eerily similar conditions, all of whom had consumed seafood caught just hours before. Other divers emerged from the sea struggling to breathe, exhausted and weak. Suspicion narrowed to one potential culprit: the massive Formosa Hot ENH steel plant, a Taiwanese-owned facility operating near the very waters where the disaster had begun on April 25. Despite growing panic, beaches in B&H remained filled with swimmers and families enjoying the warm weather. The water looked clear, the waves inviting. Few realized the danger hidden below the surface. That illusion ended abruptly on April 26, 2016, with fish dying en masse and hospitals stretched to capacity. The government imposed an urgent ban. Swimming, fishing, and all seafood harvesting in the affected provinces were prohibited overnight. The ocean, once the lifeblood of central Vietnam, was declared off-limits. The ban struck like a hammer blow. Fishing boats lay idle in their harbors. Seafood markets turned into ghost towns, and entire communities were left without income for generations. Families had survived on what the sea provided. Now, they were forbidden to cast their nets at all. Government testing confirmed the severity of the contamination. Cyanide, ammonium, and phenol remained dangerously high in the waters, and though the state promised financial relief, the compensation schemes brought little comfort. Each fisherman received just 40,000 Vietnamese dong around to United States dollars, some so small it barely covered a meal, let alone weeks of lost livelihood. The June 30th press conference, the truth finally surfaced under mounting evidence, growing public fury, and international pressure. The Vietnamese government announced that the Formosa Hot Tin Steel Corporation was indeed responsible for discharging toxic industrial waste directly into the sea. The toxic cocktail of chemicals, including phenol, cyanide, and iron hydroxide, had spread across more than 200 kilometers of coastline, wiping out fish stocks and devastating the livelihoods of entire fishing communities. The government declared that Formosa's actions had caused the most serious environmental disaster in Vietnam's history. For the first time since April, there was clarity, and with that clarity came accountability. Formosa publicly admitted responsibility and issued a rare apology. The company agreed to pay $500 million USD in compensation, intended to cover the economic losses of affected fishermen, restore the marine environment, and support those whose lives had been uprooted. But the announcement was far from a resolution to the families who had lived for generations by the sea. No amount of money could replace what was lost. The fishery industry in central Vietnam had collapsed. Tens of thousands were left without jobs. Many who received compensation said it was too little. Too late. Others claimed they never saw a single cent, as corruption and bureaucracy swallowed the funds before they reached the victims. Meanwhile, Formosa vowed to improve its waste treatment systems and claimed it would operate in compliance with Vietnamese environmental laws moving forward. Yet, many saw this as nothing more than corporate damage control. The disaster left behind scars that went far beyond polluted waters. It exposed a deep fracture between the Vietnamese government, its people, and powerful foreign investors. It showed how, in the pursuit of industrial growth, environmental safeguards could be ignored with catastrophic consequences years later. Distrust lingers. Many coastal families still refuse to eat seafood caught in the waters once poisoned by Formosa's waste. Some fishermen have never returned to the sea. Others left their villages entirely, forced into migration in search of survival. The Formosa fish kill of 2016 was not just an environmental tragedy. It was a turning point for Vietnam, a painful reminder of how corporate negligence and government opacity can devastate both people and planet. Laid to rest in Hanoi, the country's Minister of Natural Resources and Environment finally confirmed what so many had feared. The chemicals that ravaged marine life across 4 provinces had come directly from the Formosa Steel Corporation. The disaster, all traced back to a hidden pipeline buried beneath the seabed. It began in early April 2016. Local divers made a startling discovery on April 6th. A discharge pipeline stretching out from the Formosa steel plant in Ha Tinh. At that time, the plant had been carrying out wet coking, a high-temperature process that converts coal into coke while using water. In theory, the process can also treat industrial wastewater, breaking down complex organic pollutants, but in practice, wet coking is notorious. Environmental experts had long warned against it, citing its high pollution levels, hazardous emissions, and the dangers of improper byproduct disposal. Those warnings went unheeded in central Vietnam, and the result was catastrophic. From that pipeline came a flow of yellow effluent, laced with phenol and cyanide, 2 of the deadliest industrial poisons known to science. Even in trace amounts, they can kill. Poured untreated into the sea, they devastated entire ecosystems overnight. When the truth emerged, Formosa's parent group, Formosa Plastics, was forced to accept responsibility. They agreed to pay $500 million USD in compensation to aid fishermen rehabilitate the poisoned waters, an attempt to restore marine life. But experts warned that money alone could not solve the problem. Time was the real cost. Scientific estimates suggested it would take 50 to 70 years before marine ecosystems along Vietnam's central coast could fully recover for families who had fished those waters for generations. The damage was irreversible. As the summer of 2016 ended, it seemed as if Vietnam was ready to turn the page. In a highly publicized display, provincial officials waded into the waters of Quang Trao, swimming and later dining on local seafood. Newspapers framed it as a symbolic rebirth, a declaration that the sea and the nation had begun to heal. But that image of resilience masked deeper wounds 3 years later. In October 2019, tragedy struck on the other side of the world in Essex, England. Police made a horrifying discovery: a refrigerated truck abandoned on the roadside, containing 39 frozen bodies. All of the victims were Vietnamese. Many were young men and women who had left their homeland, seeking work and opportunity. Abroad. Among them were people from Ha Tinh, the same province, scarred by the Formosa disaster. Once again, Ha Tinh's name returned to the headlines, this time as part of a story of human desperation and loss. Ripple effects of 2016 had not ended with poisoned seas. They had driven families into poverty, fueled mass migration, and ultimately contributed to one of the darkest human smuggling tragedies in modern European history. For many in Vietnam, the conclusion was unavoidable. The actions of the Formosa Steel Corporation had not only destroyed their coastlines, but indirectly cost human lives thousands of miles away. What began as an environmental crime had become, in their eyes, a slow-motion act of mass killing. The police quickly secured the crime scene, cordoning off the once tranquil field that was now drenched in horror. Investigators immediately recognized the brutality of the attack. The victim's face was so violently disfigured that visual identification was impossible. Her body, half naked and discarded like garbage, told the story of a merciless assault that went far beyond simple violence. It was personal. Driven by a fury that sought to erase not just life, but identity, news spread like wildfire across Lapu-Lapu City, shocking residents and sending waves of fear through the community. Parents clutched their children closer, and young women avoided walking alone. This was not a random accident, nor was it a case of opportunistic crime. The savagery of the scene suggested something deeper, an act born out of hatred, envy, or revenge. Soon, forensic experts arrived, carefully documenting the crime scene. They noted the absence of personal belongings, no phone, no bag, no jewelry, which initially made it difficult to identify the victim. But later that same day, word came from a nearby school. A 16-year-old girl named Christine Lee Silawan had not returned home the previous night. Christine was a bright, devout student. Known for her active involvement in her local church, she often volunteered as a lector during Mass, and her gentle demeanor made her well-loved among classmates and parishioners alike. For her family, the news that police had found a body matching her description was devastating. DNA confirmation and dental records would later verify the unimaginable truth. The mutilated girl in the field was indeed Christine Silawan, but even as her family grieved, investigators worked urgently to determine who could have committed such a gruesome act. One detail stood out immediately. Christine's face had been skinned, stripped of flesh in a manner so chilling it stunned even seasoned investigators. The media soon compared it to ritualistic killings, while others whispered of satanic cults. Rumors swirled across social media, only deepening the panic. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered something far less supernatural and far more human. The roots of this tragedy lay not in dark rituals, but in an emotion as old as time, jealousy. The officers already had a sense of who the victim was. Whispers rippled through the gathered crowd, carrying an unspoken understanding that many seemed to share. Acting swiftly, the police set up a perimeter and covered the body with a sheet. Among themselves, they exchanged knowing glances and quiet conversations, piecing together fragments of information beneath the murmurs and rumors. It was clear that this grisly discovery might be connected to the reports they had received the night before. March 11th, 2019, was a Monday, just the day before, on Sunday, the Philippines, where nearly 90% of the population identifies as Catholic, had observed its customary day of worship. Families and individuals dressed in their Sunday best had filled the churches, singing hymns and participating in rituals that reaffirmed their faith. But for one family, that Sunday was unlike any other. On March 10th, after the congregation dispersed, police received an urgent report. A 16-year-old girl named Christine Lee Silawan was missing. Christine lived with her family in the eastern part of Lapu-Lapu City. She was the second of 3 children and shared a special bond with her mother. Her older sister worked as a teacher, while her 2 younger siblings, aged 13 and 14, admired her deeply. A 9th grade student at Maribago National High School, Christine was remembered by her friends for her kindness and joyful spirit. Her mother fondly recalled that Christine dreamed of becoming a flight attendant one day, often speaking of her ambitions to her siblings with youthful excitement. Christine was also a dedicated volunteer at the Sacred Heart Parish, a familiar face at services and religious events every Sunday. From 4 p.m. to 7 p.m., she faithfully attended church, a routine she rarely deviated from. But on March 10th, she did not come home after Mass. When Christine failed to return at her usual time, her mother, Mrs. Silawan, immediately sensed something was wrong. Gripped by mounting anxiety, she went to the local police station to file a missing persons report. By nightfall, with no sign of Christine, the family's worry had turned into panic, setting off a frantic search through their tight-knit community. As the hours stretched into the evening, word of her disappearance spread quickly. Neighbors and fellow parishioners joined in prayer for her safe return, unaware that Christine was already in unimaginable danger. By Monday morning, just hours after the first sighting of the body, the crime scene swelled with residents. News of the discovery had spread quickly, drawing a large crowd of onlookers, desperate to know what had happened. Though the body was covered with a white sheet, Strong gusts of wind lifted the fabric at times, revealing disturbing glimpses of the victim beneath. Villagers traded fearful speculations, many already suspecting the girl's identity, but confirmation would come only from the police when the autopsy report was released. It left no room for doubt. The mutilated body in the field was that of Christine Lee. Silhouette findings were horrifying. Christine had been stabbed 27 times. 9 of the wounds were defensive injuries on her arms, while a deep cut to her neck was identified as the likely cause of death. Even more gruesome, her face had been flayed, the skin peeled away from one side to the other, leaving parts of her skull exposed. Some of her internal organs, in her tongue, windpipe, sections of her neck, and her right ear, were missing. Initially, some speculated that stray animals might have caused the horrific damage, but experts dismissed this theory, noting that animals would not confine themselves to her face and neck alone. Further examination revealed that a corrosive substance, likely a strong acid, had been poured onto her face before it was peeled, away strong evidence that these injuries had been inflicted deliberately. Autopsy also revealed severe bruising and abrasions on her private parts, indicating she had been raped. Investigators concluded that extreme force must have been used, as there were signs of both internal and external bleeding, even before the final report was released. The sight of Christine's body had already left witnesses shaken. Some villagers were so traumatized that they reportedly could not bring themselves to eat meat for weeks afterward. When uncensored photographs of her corpse began circulating online, the horror deepened. Many who saw the images, especially teenagers, were left disturbed and unable to process what they had witnessed. The circulation of these photos sparked outrage, compounding the grief of a community already reeling from tragedy. On March 23, 2019, Christine was laid to rest at the Catalia Cemetery in Cordova town. The air was heavy with sorrow as family, friends, and neighbors gathered to say goodbye to a girl whose life had been so brutally cut short. One heart-wrenching image from the funeral showed Christine's mother, Lord Silouan, leaning over her daughter's casket, her face contorted in unbearable grief as tears streamed down. Christine's burial marked a moment of profound mourning for the entire community, yet beneath the grief ran another current: urgency. With Christine laid to rest, the question remained, who had done this, and why? The community, alongside authorities, was more determined than ever to bring her killer to justice. With Jonas Martel Bueno cleared, investigators were back to square one. Public outrage was growing louder, and the pressure to deliver justice for Christine was mounting. Days later, a breakthrough arrived in the form of CCTV footage. The grainy video showed Christine walking late at night with a male companion. The angle only caught their backs, obscuring the man's identity. But one detail stood out: Christine appeared calm, showing no signs of fear. Whoever this man was, she clearly knew Jim. Investigators turned to Christine's social media for answers. Focusing on her Facebook Messenger conversations, 2 names emerged: CJ Diaz, who appeared to be a new romantic interest, and JN, her ex-boyfriend. National Bureau of Investigation, NBI, quickly zeroed in on Juan. They learned that Christine and Juan had dated for nearly a year, but she had broken things off just days before her murder. Investigators theorized that JN, unable to accept the breakup and jealous of her new admirer, created the CJ Diaz profile to lure her out the night she was killed. JN's family immediately pushed back. His mother detailed his whereabouts on March 10th, tidying his room in the morning, playing basketball with friends through the afternoon, and returning home before 7 p.m. for dinner, after which he stayed in for the night. His basketball companions corroborated this timeline, and his brother added that JN and Christine's relationship had actually been short-lived, barely 5 days in June 2018, making it unlikely he still harbored resentment despite this. Investigators pressed forward. They pointed to circumstantial evidence: a shirt resembling the one seen in the CCTV footage, and JN's cracked phone, which they suggested may have been damaged in a struggle with Christine. Even the mayor of Lapu-Lapu City, fueled speculation, suggesting multiple people could have been involved by now. Public opinion was shifting against JN, and at just 16 years old, he was thrust into the center of the storm as the prime suspect. The NBI later announced that JN had confessed to the crime while in custody, but this admission came before a lawyer was present, raising serious doubts about its legitimacy, considering he was a minor, vulnerable to pressure and coercion. Authorities nevertheless treated it as a breakthrough. JN was then sent for a psychiatric evaluation, where he demonstrated a clear understanding of right and wrong. Prosecutors used this result against him, arguing it proved he was fully aware of his actions if he had indeed committed the murder. The regional police echoed this stance, claiming JN was of sound mind when he allegedly lured, assaulted, stabbed, and mutilated Christine. They pointed again to the shirt, the cracked phone, and the fact that his alibis came solely from friends and family, who naturally had reason to protect him. Yet, beneath the confident press briefings and bold media statements, cracks in the case were already showing. Much of the evidence against JN rested on a questionable confession and circumstantial claims. Hardly the airtight case investigators wanted the public to believe. The Christine Silouan case, betrayal, brutality, and just to say town in shock when Christine's mutilated body was discovered. The picturesque streets of Lapu-Lapu City transformed overnight from vibrant and bustling to a community cloaked in grief and terror. Parents feared letting their children out of sight. Teachers spoke in hushed tones. Churches that had once celebrated Christine's youthful spirit now became gathering places for vigils in her honor. Christine was not just another face in the crowd. At only 16 years old, she was a model of innocence and faith. A lector in her parish, a diligent student, and a daughter known for her kindness. That someone could extinguish such light in such a violent manner seemed beyond comprehension. But the brutality of the crime also carried a powerful undertone. Whoever did this wanted to send a message. This wasn't a quiet killing. This was a spectacle meant to terrify, to make a statement, to erase Christine's identity in the cruelest possible way. The wrong suspect. In the frantic early hours of the investigation, police latched onto a name that seemed to fit: Jonas Martel Bueno, a 62-year-old criminal with a violent past. Jonas had previously been charged with murdering and skinning a farmer. His background was soaked in whispers of cult activity, with rumors claiming he and his brothers had once been part of a sect that practiced cannibalism. The gruesome similarities between his prior crimes and Christine's murder were undeniable almost immediately. Social media erupted. Hashtags demanding his execution trended. Nationwide posts filled with rage and grief painted Jonas as the monster who had stolen Christine's life. When police arrested him, Jonas himself was bewildered. To him, this felt like a cruel déjà vu. He insisted he had never met Christine and had no knowledge of the crime. The interrogation produced nothing but denials for seasoned investigators. This was not unusual. Most criminals deny guilt at first, but there was something different about Jonas this time. He wasn't lying. A deeper probe into his movements, phone records, and possible connections revealed that Jonas had no link whatsoever to Christine. He was cleared and released. The police, however, now faced renewed urgency and public fury. If Jonas wasn't the killer, then who was? A breakthrough on tape. The first real breakthrough came in the form of CCTV footage. The grainy recording, captured near the location where Christine was last seen, showed her walking beside a man. There were no signs of struggle, no attempts at escape. The young girl walked calmly, almost as if she trusted him. The problem was the footage only captured their backs. The man's face was obscured. Investigators noted something crucial. Christine was not afraid. She knew this person. She trusted him enough to walk with him into the darkness of that fatal night. The police turned to the modern diary of teenagers everywhere. Social media messages that mattered on Christine's Facebook Messenger. Two names stood out: C.J. Diaz, a supposed new romantic, N-T-E-R-E-S-T-J-N. Her ex-boyfriend Pulis began with J.N. whose real identity was that of a 16-year-old boy. Just like Christine, their history wasn't extensive. Some reports suggested they had dated for a year, while others insisted it was no more than 5 days, regardless of the duration. Investigators speculated the relationship had ended badly, possibly because Christine had taken an interest in someone else. Could heartbreak and rejection have driven JN to kill? The investigation deepened when NBI agents suggested that JN himself might have created the CJ Diaz account, a catfish identity designed to lure Christine, if true. This meant her death was not just a crime of passion, but a carefully plotted act of deception and revenge. The mother's defense: when the accusations began swirling, JN's mother rushed to defend her son. She provided a detailed timeline of his activities on the day of the crime: morning, tidying his room; afternoon, playing basketball with friends until late evening, returning home around 7 p.m. for dinner, after which he stayed in his basketball companions, corroborated his presence during the afternoon. His brother also testified that while he knew about Christine, the relationship had been short-lived and uneventful, but investigators weren't convinced. They pointed to evidence they claimed was damning: a shirt similar to the one seen in the CCTV footage, cracked phone, allegedly, damaged during a struggle with Christine, for authorities under immense public pressure. This seemed enough. The questionable confession. The turning point came when the NBA claimed to have extracted a confession from JN, but there was a problem. Actually, several. JN was a minor. No lawyer was present during the confession. Questions of coercion loomed large. His family insisted that any admission he made was under duress, and legal experts quickly pointed out that such a confession held little weight in court. Nonetheless, prosecutors pushed forward. They ordered a psychiatric evaluation. If JN were found incapable of distinguishing right from wrong, he might face reduced culpability, but if he passed, the full force of the law could come crashing down. To the dismay of his defense, JN passed. Psychiatrists deemed him of sound mind. For prosecutors, this was gold. They could now argue that JN, if guilty, committed the act knowingly and deliberately. Pressure and political statements. The investigation unfolded not in silence, but in a deafening storm of public discourse. Media outlets broadcast every twist. Social media magnified rumors into perceived truths. Politicians, sensing the public mood, weighed in with inflammatory comments. The mayor of Lapu-Lapu City even suggested the crime may have been carried out by multiple perpetrators, fueling speculation about accomplices. The pressure on law enforcement was immense. They had to deliver a suspect, a narrative, and ultimately a conviction. Jung, heartbroken and conveniently linked to Kristen, became the perfect fit. A family in mourning. Meanwhile, Christine's family was left in ruins. Her mother, in particular, struggled to accept the brutality of her daughter's fate. Christine had been deeply religious. Serving as a lector at her parish, she had dreams of becoming successful. Of helping her family. To lose her in such a grotesque way felt like a cruel betrayal by life itself. At her funeral, Christine's casket was closed, not because the family wished it, but because the damage to her face was too severe. Mourners gathered in silence, many weeping not only for Christine, but for the reminder of how fragile and fleeting innocence can be. The image of Christine smiling in photos, holding a Bible, serving at church stood in horrific contrast to the crime scene photos. The public never saw, but police would never forget the courtroom battles as the case proceeded. The focus was on whether there was enough admissible evidence to convict JN. The alleged confession without a lawyer was shaky at best. The shirt and cracked phone were circumstantial. The CCTV footage was suggestive but not definitive yet. Prosecutors argued that the digital trail, Christine's conversations with the fake account, the supposed jealousy motive, and JN's proximity formed a compelling picture. The defense countered that the state was building a case on shaky ground, eager to satisfy public anger rather than pursue truth. They emphasized JN's age, the coercive environment of the interrogation, and the lack of direct forensic evidence tying him to the mutilation. Public opinion: guilty until proven innocent. For many in the Philippines, the case was already decided in their hearts. Christine was an innocent girl. JN was the ex-boyfriend. The story wrote itself. Rejected love turned to rage. Rage turned to brutality. Hashtags demanding justice flooded timelines. Vigilante rhetoric seeped into online forums. The idea of JN's innocence was rarely entertained, and those who defended him were often silenced by accusations of disrespecting Christine's memory. This created a dangerous environment just for the accused, but for the very concept of due process, the broader issues beyond the personal tragedy. Christine's case raised broader issues in Philippine society. Juvenile justice. Should a 60-year-old be tried as an adult for such a crime? Police conduct. Can confessions without lawyers truly be trusted? Media influence. Does relentless coverage compromise the fairness of trials? Violence against women. Why do so many cases of gender-based violence end in death? For many advocates, Christine's death became more than a case. It was a mirror reflecting systemic failings, legacy, and memory years later. Christine's name continues to be remembered in Lapu-Lapu City. Her case serves as both a cautionary tale about online deception and a rallying cry for protecting women and children. For her family, though no amount of advocacy or remembrance could fill the void, every birthday, every Christmas, every mass she once served at became a reminder of the daughter they lost. Christine's life ended at 16, but the questions her death raised will linger for generations. Was justice truly served? Was the right person convicted? And most importantly, how can society prevent another Christine Silawan? The evidence in the case initially appeared fragile, relying more on circumstantial elements than solid proof. Many in the public began questioning whether investigators had rushed to judgment, perhaps motivated by the pressure to calm public outrage and deliver swift justice. Despite these doubts, Christine's mother released a statement, unwavering in her belief that John and his companions bore responsibility for her daughter's death. Then, on April 9, 2019, a major twist rocked the case. Police introduced an entirely new suspect, Ronaldo Peñalenas, a 43-year-old father of 5, who had already been under surveillance for firearms and drug offenses. He was taken into custody for possessing an unlicensed .45 caliber pistol, charges completely unrelated to Christine's murder. Yet while detained, he made a chilling and unexpected confession. Ronaldo admitted that he had disguised himself online as a teenage boy, using a fake Facebook account under the name CJ Diaz to lure young girls into talking to him. Among his many victims was Christine Lee Silawan. Their online conversations began in late 2018 and continued for about 5 months. Christine, believing CJ to be a teenage student like herself, eventually wanted to meet him in person. For weeks, Ronaldo had dodged her requests, always making excuses, but by March 2019, he decided to follow through. Convinced that after months of chatting, she wouldn't reject him, he showed up outside her church on March 10th, waiting confidently to meet her. When Christine saw him, a middle-aged man, instead of the teenage boy she expected, she was stunned. She tried to walk away, but Ronaldo persisted, insisting on escorting her home during the walk. He shockingly asked if she would have sex with him. Christine, disgusted, rejected him outright and told him she would call her ex-boyfriend John to come get her. That rejection enraged him, fueled by jealousy and humiliation. Ronaldo dragged Christine into a nearby field. What happened next was horrifying. According to his own confession, he used a pair of scissors to stab her more than 30 times. He then mutilated her face, peeling away her skin in an attempt to make her unrecognizable. He admitted to learning the gruesome method through disturbing videos he had seen online. Afterward, he took her bag and discarded both it and the pieces of skin a short distance from the crime scene. Ronaldo admitted he had been high on drugs during the attack, but said guilt quickly consumed him once he saw news of Christine's death while being held in the city police station. He asked forgiveness from her family, saying his conscience would not let him rest, especially knowing that a teenage boy, John, had wrongfully been blamed and shunned for a crime he himself had committed. So, Ronaldo's account didn't answer every question. Official reports remained silent on key inconsistencies. For instance, Christine's autopsy revealed missing organs, unexplained bite marks, and traces of sulfuric acid details. Ronaldo never acknowledged he also denied sexually assaulting her, despite forensic evidence that suggested otherwise. Another troubling mystery was how the brutal attack had gone unnoticed. The field was close to residential houses, and it wasn't particularly late at night. How could Ronaldo drag Christine, stab her repeatedly, and mutilate her body without anyone hearing her cries for help? The case should have moved toward trial, but the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020 delayed proceedings then. On May 24, 2020, another shocking twist came. Ronaldo was found hanging in the bathroom of his detention cell. Guards rushed him to a hospital, but he was pronounced dead on arrival. His death reopened debates across the Philippines about justice. The death penalty had been abolished in 1987, briefly reinstated in 1993, then abolished again in 2006. Yet as news of Christine's case and Ronaldo's suicide spread, citizens flooded social media, demanding the return of capital punishment, arguing that crimes as heinous as Christine's murder warranted the harshest possible penalty. Her dreams extended beyond her small town. Junko had aspirations of becoming an idol singer, a dream that demanded courage, discipline, and unwavering dedication. She wasn't naive. However, Junko knew how difficult that path could be. Still, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her classmates recalling how she rarely engaged in gossip or distractions, focusing instead on her future. It was this very focus that made Junko stand out. While many of her peers were beginning to experiment with dating, Junko often kept her distance. She was polite but firm in rejecting advances, always prioritizing her academics and part-time work. Unbeknownst to her, however, this would put her in the crosshairs of someone who would not take rejection lightly. In November 1988, just 2 months before her abduction, Junko was approached by a boy at school named Hiroshi Miyano. He was older than her, and unlike Junko, he carried with him a reputation, one that commanded fear rather than respect. Miyano was already tied to the local Busozoku biker gang and was said to have family connections to the Yakuza, Japan's infamous organized crime syndicate. He projected arrogance and danger, the kind of boy most classmates avoided. When Miyano expressed interest in Junko, she did what she had done countless times before. She politely declined, but Miyano wasn't like the others to him. Rejection wasn't a matter of preference, it was an insult, one that his pride would not allow him to forgive. Weeks later, on November 25, 1988, Junko left her part-time job at the factory around 8:30 p.m., pedaling her bicycle home as she had done many times before. She had no reason to believe anything was amiss, but that evening, Miyano and his friend Nobuharu Minato put into motion a plan fueled by anger, entitlement, and cruelty. As Junko made her way down a quiet street, another boy, Shinji Minato, stepped into her path and kicked her bicycle, sending her sprawling to the ground. Within moments, Miyano appeared, pretending to be a concerned passerby, offering to help. He convinced Junko that he would walk her home. Safely grateful for the assistance and still shaken from the sudden incident, Junko agreed, but instead of heading toward her home, Miyano led her in the opposite direction. By the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. Miyano dragged her into an abandoned warehouse, where he revealed his true intentions. Junko was assaulted that night for the first time. From that moment forward, her nightmare began. But it didn't end there. Knowing that Junko would likely report the assault, Miyano escalated further. He and his accomplices forced her to a house in Yasi, Hadaki City, the home of Nobuharu, Minato's parents. It was here that Junko would be imprisoned for the next 44 days. At first, the Minato family claimed they were unaware of what was happening under their roof. But the truth is more complicated. Neighbors and even classmates were later reported to have visited the house, Some aware of Junko's captivity, the sheer number of people who knew or at least suspected what was happening, yet said nothing, is one of the most haunting aspects of this case. From late November until January 1989, Junko endured unimaginable suffering. She was repeatedly assaulted, sometimes by multiple perpetrators in a single day. Reports later revealed that as many as over 100 individuals were invited into the house to abuse her, a staggering number that underscores how far the cruelty spread. Her captors subjected her to sadistic forms of torture. She was beaten with golf clubs and iron rods. Firecrackers were lit inside her body. She was forced to drink her own urine and eat cockroaches. She was burned with cigarettes and lighters until her skin blistered at one point. She was hung from the ceiling as a punching bag even during these relentless attacks. She was starved, deprived of water, and denied the dignity of clothing or medical care. The level of violence escalated to the point that Junko's body began to shut down by the third week. She was so weak she could hardly move. She begged her captors to kill her, simply to end the pain, but instead, they mocked her pleas, treating her as an object of entertainment. Perhaps the most devastating part of Junko's story is that she came painfully close to being rescued on December 12, 1988. After weeks of captivity, she managed to find a moment of courage and dialed the police from a telephone inside the house. The officers arrived shortly after, knocking on the Minato home, but instead of searching thoroughly, they accepted the reassurance from Minato's parents that no such girl was inside. The officers left. Junko's cries for help were silenced once more. The torture continued. By January, Junko's injuries were catastrophic. She was reportedly unable to stand. Her internal organs severely damaged. On January 4, 1989, the final act of violence took place after losing a game of mahjong. Miyano and the others took out their anger on Junko, beating her for hours. When she fell unconscious, they covered her in blankets and left her to die. She passed away sometime during the night. The boys stuffed her body into a 55-gallon drum, filled it with concrete, and abandoned it at the construction site in KT City for weeks. Her family searched, her school mourned her absence, and police combed neighborhoods, unaware she lay entombed in that drum. It wasn't until March 29, 1989, that the truth emerged, acting on a confession during an unrelated investigation. Police uncovered the drum and discovered Junko's remains. She was just 17 years old. The crime shocked Japan not only because of the sheer brutality, but because of the staggering number of people who had known and chosen silence. When the trials began, the public expected the harshest penalties, but because the perpetrators were all juveniles, Hiroshi Nobuharu Minato, Shinji Minato, and Joe Ogura, they were shielded from the death penalty. Their sentences ranged from 4 to 20 years. Sentences many in Japan still see as a devastating miscarriage of justice. Junko Furuta's story became one of the most infamous cases in Japan's history, a symbol of both human cruelty and societal failure for her parents. There was no closure, only grief compounded by the knowledge that those responsible for their daughter's torment would one day walk free even decades later. The name Junko Furuta evokes horror, sorrow, and outrage. Her case is more than a crime. Is a chilling reminder of what happens when cruelty meets apathy, when the cries of the vulnerable go unheard. Junko Furuta's love for music was inseparable from her desire to inspire others, though she kept her dreams largely to herself. Those closest to her understood how deeply she longed to stand on a stage and bring joy to others through her voice. Like many teenagers, Junko navigated the complexities of adolescence, friendships, schoolwork, and personal ambitions, but she did so with quiet strength and determination. To her family, she was a source of immense pride. To her friends, a trustworthy confidant, and to herself, a girl with big dreams and a drive to see them realized. For 17 years, her life was filled with hope and potential, a future waiting to unfold. But on the evening of November 25, 1988, that future would be cruelly stolen. 18-year-old Hiroshi Miyano and 16-year-old Shinji Minato roamed the quiet streets of Mizuto. On their motorcycles, both were high school dropouts, with prior brushes with the law. Miyano, at 18, carried a dangerous sense of authority, bolstered by his connections to the Yakuza, giving him a reputation for being untouchable. Minato, just 16, often played the role of follower, executing Miyano's orders without hesitation. That night, they prowled the streets with dark intent, seeking vulnerable women to harass, rob, and overpower a few miles from their path. Junko Furuta had just finished her shift at a plastic factory, riding her bicycle through the cool November air. She followed her familiar route home, her mind likely wandering to her graduation trip she had been saving for so diligently. Every turn of the pedals brought her closer to her dreams from a distance. Miyano spotted her, a lone teenage girl, unaware of the danger approaching. Following his orders, Minato accelerated, swerving close enough to knock Junko from her bicycle. She crashed to the ground, her belongings scattering as the two boys sped off into the shadows. But Miyano didn't leave. Circling back, he approached Junko under the guise of concern, offering to escort her home. Vulnerable and shaken, she accepted, unaware that this gesture was the first step into a nightmare. As they walked, Miyano subtly guided Junko off her usual route, toward a desolate area dominated by an abandoned warehouse. Unease likely began to creep in as familiar streets gave way to shadowed alleys and empty buildings. Still, Miyano's outward calm masked his true intentions. Once inside the warehouse, the atmosphere shifted abruptly. The mask of concern dropped, replaced by a cold, commanding presence. Miyano revealed he was a member of the Yakuza, threatening Junko with severe consequences should she refuse to comply with his orders. Trapped, powerless, and alone, she had no choice but to obey. The next moments marked the beginning of a harrowing ordeal that would strip her of freedom, dignity, and, ultimately, her life. After luring Junko into his control, Miyano hailed a taxi and transported her to a hotel in Adachi. Away from any prying eyes there, he began his assault, raping her repeatedly, exploiting her vulnerability and isolation. The confinement offered her captor total dominance, leaving Junko entirely at his mercy. Following the assault, Miyano contacted Joe Ogura, one of his closest accomplices, boasting about the crime in disturbing detail. Ogura, far from expressing concern, encouraged Miyano to continue, and ensured that Junko would not be released, warning of the consequences if she escaped. He then reached out to the other accomplices, Shinji Minato and Yasushi Watanabe, informing them of the situation. Together, the four boys devised a twisted plan to maintain control over cementing her fate. In the early morning hours of November 26th, Miyano led Junko to a park near the hotel. There, Ogura, Minato, and Watanabe were already waiting, using Junko's home address as leverage. They threatened her with harm, claiming the Yakuza would retaliate against her family if she disobeyed. Terrified, Junko had no choice but to comply. Brief discussion followed among the group about what to do next. Releasing her was not an option. Ogura had made it clear that she could not leave, and the boys understood the consequences of going to the authorities. They agreed Junko would remain under their control for their continued abuse. It was then that Minato suggested using his family home in Adachi, the second-floor room. He explained, would provide the privacy they needed to carry out their plans without interruption. With that decision, Junko was taken to Minato's home, where she would remain for the next 42 days. Trapped within four walls while her captors dictated every aspect of her existence, each day brought unspeakable torment, stripping away her autonomy and humanity. Meanwhile, back at home, Junko's parents grew increasingly alarmed when she failed to return. The following evening, they filed a missing persons report with the police. Days passed, with no word, and their worry escalated into fear. Junko, who was responsible and reliable, had never disappeared without explanation. Her captors, however, were already aware of the report. To maintain control, they forced Junko to make 3 separate phone calls to her mother, ensuring that she would appear compliant while hiding the truth of her captivity. Junko's calls to her mother were carefully orchestrated under duress, She was forced to assure her family that she had left voluntarily, claiming she was staying safely with friends. Her parents were left confused and heartbroken. Struggling to reconcile the words coming through the line with the daughter, they knew Junko had always been responsible, dependable, and deeply connected. To her family, she would never have run away willingly yet. Despite their doubts, the carefully manipulated phone calls planted seeds of uncertainty. Could this really have been her choice? Was there something they didn't know? By the final call, the cruelty of her captors reached a new level. Junko was forced to instruct her mother to halt the missing person investigation entirely. Delivering these words must have been devastating, for her betraying the very people who were her greatest source of love and safety. All while trapped in an unfamiliar, hostile environment, her despair must have been suffocating. A crushing sense of hopelessness settling over her with the investigation stalled. The captors strengthened their ruse when Minato's parents were at home. Junko was ordered to pretend to be Minato's girlfriend. She complied, forced into the charade, but every move was closely monitored by the boys initially. Minato's parents accepted the act at face value, but as days turned into weeks, it became increasingly difficult to ignore what was happening. Strange noises, muffled cries, thuds, and whispered conversations echoed from behind the second-floor door. Late into the night, the boys came and went frequently, sometimes bringing friends, while Junko remained confined, unseen by anyone else. The story of Junko Furuta is regarded as one of the most horrifying criminal cases in modern history. What followed in the next 42 days of her captivity was unimaginable, and some details are so graphic they are deeply unsettling. Upon her arrival in the room, the four boys Miyano, Joe Ogira, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe began subjecting her to relentless abuse. Junko was repeatedly raped and physically beaten, but the violence did not remain limited to the initial four. They invited others to join, and over the course of her captivity, it is estimated that up to 100 individuals were aware of her imprisonment, with several participating directly in her suffering. She endured sexual assault more than 400 times over the 42 days. By November 28th, the brutality escalated. The four boys invited two additional individuals, Tetsuo Nakamura and Kichi Aratu, participate. Junko suffered horrifying gang rape, as each of the 6 boys took turns assaulting her. Following the assaults, they sought new ways to degrade her further. Minato shaved her pubic hair with a razor and burned her genital area with a lit match, leaving her with severe burns. Any resistance from Junko was met with further violence. Her legs were burned with lighters, hot wax dripped on her face, and foreign objects, bottles and metal rods were inserted into her body, causing severe internal injuries on some days. As many as 12 individuals assaulted her. Humiliation became constant. She was forced to remain naked, urinated on, and compelled to perform explicit acts. For their amusement, she was beaten daily with golf clubs, iron rods, bamboo sticks, and dumbbells. Her head was repeatedly stomped on the floor. Hot wax dripped on her face, particularly her eyelids, which were also burned with cigarettes and lighters. She was deprived of proper food and water, often forced to consume cockroaches and her own urine. Fireworks were inserted into her body, and in one horrifying incident, pliers were used to tear off her left nipple. She was suspended from the ceiling, shoved into a freezer, and sewing needles were embedded into her skin. A lit light bulb was inserted into her body until it shattered. By the end of her ordeal, Junko's face was so swollen and disfigured that her features were barely recognizable. Her body was covered in festering wounds, bleeding heavily from repeated assaults, and her sinuses clogged with blood, making breathing difficult. By New Year's Day, 1989, Junko was barely able to move. Her spirit crushed, she pleaded with her captors to end her suffering, begging for death as her only escape, yet they refused. As weeks passed, her captors' cruelty extended beyond Junko, as her injuries and deterioration made her less appealing to them. They targeted a 19-year-old woman whom they attacked in a similar fashion, unlike Junko. This second victim was eventually released after 3 days in January 4th, 1989. The boys forced Junko to play a game of mahjong, despite her weakened state. She won, and their reaction was vicious. Miyano dripped hot wax from candles onto her face, even onto her eyelids, and kicked her onto a stereo unit. Triggering violent convulsions from the trauma panic briefly seized the boys, revealing the extent of their awareness, that their actions had spiraled beyond control. Desperate to regain control of the situation, the perpetrators escalated their brutality, determined not to leave incriminating evidence on themselves. They covered their hands with plastic bags and proceeded to beat Junko savagely, but even that was not enough. They dropped an iron exercise ball repeatedly onto her abdomen, inflicting catastrophic internal injuries. Miyano, however, was not satisfied with mere physical harm. He sought to push the violence to unimaginable extremes, grabbing a bottle of lighter fluid. He drenched Junko's battered body and set her ablaze with a match. Junko, utterly exhausted from weeks of relentless torture, struggled feebly to extinguish the flames. Her strength had long been depleted, her body too weak to resist the fire. The flames raged on, consuming what little remained of her battered form. And by 10 a.m. on January 4th, 1989, Junko Fuda's 42-day ordeal of unfathomable suffering and cruelty had finally ended. The perpetrators, realizing that they could not risk leaving her body in a location where it might be discovered, devised a grim plan to conceal the evidence. They wrapped her lifeless body in blankets, placed it in a large travel bag, and transported it to a construction site in Koto, Tokyo. There, they had acquired a 55-gallon metal drum, which they filled with quick-drying concrete, encasing Junko's body entirely. Once sealed, the drum was abandoned in a vacant lot, where it remained hidden for nearly 3 months. During this time, Junko's family remained desperate for answers, unaware of the horrific truth, while her captors carried on with their lives. Feigning normalcy, the boldness of Miyano and his accomplices did not end with Junko. They continued their criminal behavior, committing theft, assault, and other acts of violence, yet their overconfidence would eventually lead to their undoing. In early 1989, Miyano and Ogira were arrested in connection with the abduction and gang rape of a 9-year-old woman in December 1988, a crime that had taken place while Junko was still being held captive. During police questioning, Miyano made a critical error, believing that Ogira had already confessed to Junko's murder. He panicked and disclosed the location of the metal drum. Assuming that authorities were already aware of his involvement, investigators promptly followed Miyano's directions and unearthed the drum, partially buried amid construction debris. The moment they removed the concrete casing, they were confronted with the horrifying reality inside: the remains of Junko Fuda. The scope of the cruelty inflicted upon her became tragically clear for Junko's mother. The revelation was unbearable. The sheer magnitude of her daughter's suffering caused her to faint upon learning the truth. Her mental health deteriorated rapidly, and she required extended psychiatric care to cope with the trauma of discovering what had been done to her child. An autopsy provided further grim details. Small glass bottles were discovered lodged in Junko's rectal cavity, and it was revealed that she had been pregnant at some point during her captivity. Despite the severe damage inflicted on her uterus, the repeated assaults had left her face so disfigured that authorities had to rely on fingerprints to confirm her identity. That findings underscored the prolonged and systematic nature of the abuse, highlighting the deliberate and sadistic intent of her captors. With the autopsy complete, law enforcement expanded their investigation. Miyano's confession had set the process in motion, and authorities moved quickly to apprehend his accomplices. Joe Ogira, Shinji Minato, Yasushi Watanabe, and others who had participated in or had knowledge of the crimes. The arrests followed swiftly, sending shockwaves throughout their communities. Friends, neighbors, and even family members struggled to reconcile the horrific acts with the young men they thought they knew. It became evident during the independent investigation that over 100 individuals were aware of Junko's captivity, and some had participated directly in her abuse. Yet, disturbingly, no one had intervened to stop it. The media soon caught wind of the case, dubbing it the concrete-encased high school girl murder. The sheer length of Junko's captivity, coupled with the brutality she endured, drew national and international attention. Public outrage surged as citizens demanded justice and questioned how such acts of extreme cruelty could occur without any form of intervention. During the ensuing legal proceedings, the defendants were brought before the Tokyo District Court. Because most of the main suspects were minors at the time of the crime, their identities were initially protected under Japanese law. However, investigative journalists argued that the sheer severity of their crimes stripped them of any claim to anonymity. Despite the initial protections, their names and photographs were eventually published, igniting a heated debate about the balance between juvenile privacy rights and public interest. The trial itself was a harrowing experience for Junko's family. The prosecution sought life sentences, emphasizing the premeditated and prolonged nature of her suffering, while the defense argued that the offender's youth and lack of proper guidance should mitigate their punishment, appealing for rehabilitation rather than retribution for Junko's parents. Attending the trial was excruciating. Each revelation of the abuse, each detailed account of her suffering, brought unbearable anguish. Her mother, already fragile from grief, frequently had to leave the courtroom to avoid collapsing under the weight of the testimony. Testimony during the trial also revealed the complicity of Minato's parents, who admitted that they had been aware something was wrong, but claimed fear of their son and his friends prevented them from intervening. The courtroom proceedings laid bare the horrifying extent of the young men's cruelty, leaving many to question how justice could ever truly reconcile with such a crime. In July 1990, the Tokyo District Court delivered its verdict. All 4 boys were found guilty on multiple charges, including abduction for the purpose of sexual assault, confinement, rape, assault, murder, and abandonment of a corpse. However, the sentences handed down sparked widespread outrage. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, was sentenced to 17 years in prison, later increased to 20 years following appeals. His parents were also ordered to pay 50 million yen, approximately $350,000 at the time, to Junko's family in compensation. Joe Ogiura, who had advised Miyano to prevent Junko's release, received a sentence of 5 to 10 years, ultimately serving the full 10 years. Yasushi Watanabe was sentenced to 5 to 7 years, serving the full 7, while Shinji Minato received a sentence of 5 to 9 years. The lightness of these sentences shocked many. Given the horrific scale of the crimes, the punishments seemed almost inconceivably lenient. The reasons for this lay in Japan's juvenile justice system, which prioritizes rehabilitation over punitive measures for offenders under 20 years old, while designed to reintegrate young offenders into society. In Junko's case, the system's leniency sparked national outrage. Critics argued that the severity and premeditation of the crime far exceeded what could be considered juvenile misconduct. The case left a lasting mark on Japanese society. Questions lingered about societal complacency, the failure of bystanders, and the efficacy of laws meant to protect minors. Junko's tragic story became a symbol of the consequences of inaction, both at the level of individual responsibility and systemic oversight. Even decades later, discussions of the case continue to evoke strong emotional responses, serving as a grim reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by young women and the importance of vigilance and accountability for Junko's family. The legal outcomes, no matter how severe, could never restore what was lost. Her mother continued to grapple with the psychological trauma, and her father carried the unbearable weight of knowing his daughter had suffered so profoundly. The compensation and the perpetrators offered little solace in the face of the unimaginable suffering endured. The case also prompted broader societal reflection. Schools, community organizations, and law enforcement began re-evaluating policies related to adolescent vulnerability, missing persons, and the role of witnesses in preventing abuse. In the media, the story remained a stark illustration of extreme human cruelty, and the consequences of collective inaction. Discussions about juvenile sentencing, parental responsibility, and social vigilance were reignited, shaping public discourse on crime and justice in Japan. Junko Fuda's life, though tragically cut short, became a powerful testament to resilience in the face of unfathomable suffering. Her story continues to remind society of the imperative to protect the vulnerable, to speak out against wrongdoing, and to ensure that justice, no matter how loses sight of those it is meant to serve. The details of her ordeal remain a somber warning of how quickly cruelty, indifference, and neglect can converge to destroy innocence. Ultimately, the concrete encased high school girl murder remains one of the most notorious cases in Japanese history. It serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, highlighting the essential need for vigilance, compassion, and accountability at every level of society. The legacy of Junko Fuda's life, though marked by unimaginable suffering, endures as a stark reminder of the consequences of cruelty unchecked, and the enduring responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. The courtroom was soon overwhelmed with letters, phone calls, and messages from the public, all demanding harsher sentences. Many expressed disbelief that the perpetrators could ever be allowed to walk free. Public outrage extended beyond the courtroom. Vigils were held, protests were organized, and calls for reform of Japan's juvenile justice system grew louder. Junko's case had become a symbol of the system's failure to adequately address violent crimes committed by minors for her family and supporters. No sentence could ever truly reflect the magnitude of the suffering she endured despite the judicial verdicts. The release of the perpetrators came all too quickly for many. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, all 4 offenders had served their terms. Yasushi Watanabe was released in 1996 and left his hometown to live with his mother. Shinji Minato followed in 1998, also moving in with his mother. However, his criminal behavior did not end there. In 2018, he was arrested on suspicion of attempted murder after striking a 32-year-old man with a metal bat and slashing his neck during a dispute over a parking space in Kawaguchi, Saitama. In Duaribu Simbulan Blas, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Though the sentence was suspended and he was placed on 3 years probation, Joe Ogra was released in 1999 and later changed his last name to Kamisaku. Initially, he worked briefly in it but eventually returned to organized crime. In 2004, he was arrested for assaulting Toku Kosi Isano, a friend he suspected of having a relationship with his girlfriend. Ogira forced Isano into the trunk of his car, transported him to his mother's bar in Mado, and brutally assaulted him for 4 hours. For this crime, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison and released in 2009. As for the ringleader, Hiroshi Miyano, his parents were forced to sell the family home to provide the 50 million yen compensation to Junko's family upon his release in 2009. Miyano changed his last name to Yokoyama. However, reports suggest that little else about him had changed. In 2013, he was arrested on suspicion of bank fraud and orchestrating scam phone calls, but he refused to cooperate with authorities and was ultimately not charged today. All 4 men responsible for the unimaginable crimes against Junko Fuda live free lives beyond the prison walls that once confined them. Junko's funeral took place on April 2, 1989, a day heavy with grief. Friends, family, and classmates gathered to mourn a young life stolen in the most unimaginable way. Among the mourners, one of her classmates delivered a eulogy written collectively by her school friends, a tribute to the vibrant life she had lived and a solemn acknowledgement of the cruelty she endured. An excerpt from that eulogy reads, "Junko, welcome back. I never dreamed we would meet again like this. You were subjected to such cruelty, weren't you? You went through so much, and I'm upset with myself for living unaware of it. You were always so gentle and cheerful, Junko. The Japanese coat we made for the cultural festival looked wonderful on you. I will never forget that. We will absolutely not let your death be in vain. As we step into adulthood, we will strive for a world where such heinous crimes no longer exist." We will keep you in our hearts and push forward. The principal even brought your diploma thanks to this. All 47 of us in Class 3 were able to graduate Junko. There's no more pain or suffering now. Rest peacefully. Farewell, Junko. As the rain fell softly and the night deepened, Junko's story reminded everyone listening at Crime Whispers of both the fragility of life and the necessity of vigilance, even in the quiet of night. Her memory calls us to remain aware, compassionate, and determined to protect the vulnerable. Let the rain carry her to a peaceful rest. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.